Hey guys, today I'm going to be taking you through something I haven't covered before, and that's how to dye gradients in Minky. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to work out where you're going to be doing your dyeing. If you're in a rental or a place where you don't own the actual house, I would highly suggest buying a cheap little gas burner and doing this outside, because this stuff can stain anything and everything, including kitchen countertops, your cupboards, extractor fans above your oven like I have. I've even seen people accidentally dye their roof on more than one occasion, so you don't want to be doing that. This stuff is really messy to work with. So if you are doing this in a kitchen like I am, cover all of your surfaces as much as possible, preferably with something that is going to hold liquid on top of it. You can use things like newspaper, cling wrap. I'm using aluminum foil, and I've got my extractor fan running, which you can see the little shade of dye on it that I've dyed the extractor fan from previous dye batches. I've got all my windows and doors open that are near me. I've got my dyes ready. I'm using RIT dye more for synthetics. I also have used the iDye poly, and they both do exactly the same thing, except with the iDye you can get sort of uneven results if you don't mix the powder in thoroughly. I like the dye more better, this kind, because it's just a liquid that's already mixed. You're not going to get any flecks of pigment that haven't already been mixed yet. You're also going to want to get a large pot that you're only going to be using for dyeing or crafting. You never want to use anything that you've used to touch this dye for cooking or anything like that, because it is a bit toxic. Now I'm just going to be showing you guys how I dye some little strips here, because I don't want to use a huge piece of fabric, but the same process is going to apply for your larger pieces. You're going to have them all in cold water, and you're going to saturate them and make sure that there's absolutely no dry parts left on that fabric, because you can get the dye not soaking into dry areas. You want to put enough water into your pot that your minky can sort of flow freely around. If you don't have enough, you don't really sort of want bits of your minky sticking out and not being fully saturated and flowing under the water. So I've put about a third of this entire pot's worth of water in there, and probably the equivalent of maybe 1.5 bottles of that synthetic dye, and I've let that slowly start to come to a boil. You want it just below a boil. You don't want it super roiling hot, but you also don't want it too cold, because then the pigment is not going to penetrate and bind to the minky fabric. So I'm just doing a little test to see what colour the dye is going to come out. It's quite dark when you first do your initial dyeing, keep that in mind. Unless you can keep your temperature up and you continue to add more dye, the pigment that you are dyeing is going to become more and more sort of transparent over time. So I've just got these pair of tongs. I got them at a thrift store, and I use them for dyeing fabric, for mixing it around. Obviously not going to use this for food later on. And I'm just doing some initial dye tests. The thing with dyeing gradients in Minky is it takes a fair amount of tries. Even though I've had a bit of experience with it, I will definitely try to do this probably anywhere between 4 and 8 times per piece that I need as, you know, the finished piece, because it is sort of manually dipping it in and very slowly lifting it up and out so that you get that sort of gradient. As soon as you finish doing the dye and sort of putting the whole thing in and slowly lifting it upwards, you need to go and rinse it in cold water immediately, and that's going to stop the dye process. And then you can just leave that piece to sit in cold water for a little while you work on your other pieces. It can also be a good idea to sort of rinse it under a tap, give it a good scrub, and that's really going to flush all the excess dye out and give you a better idea of how your gradient has come out. Now here, I'm just doing gradients that involve me submerging the whole piece of minky and slowly lifting it upwards, but you might want something that has more contrast. So I'm dyeing very pale sort of turquoise or cyan blue minky here. So you can see that if I submerge the whole thing in this blue dye, it's going to give me sort of that powder royal blue kind of gradient. But if I want the gradient to be that bright cyan up the top going down into the dark blue, don't drop your piece into the dye bath and ruin it. What you're going to do is you're going to wet the whole thing again, and instead of submerging the whole thing and lifting up, you're going to slowly let it fall down into the bath, so doing the opposite process. And you don't want to have the upper parts of your gradient actually get dye on them, so the brightest part you want to not touch the actual dye bath, and then everything below that you only want to touch the dye bath for a small amount of time going into a longer amount of time. You know, the longer the bottom piece is in, the darker it's going to get. And this is definitely the hardest kind of gradient to do, especially if you're working with white or a very pale colour. It's going to show sort of the blockiness or the unevenness of your dye job if you don't do it absolutely perfectly. Don't worry, you will, because I do it all the time. You can also hold it with your hands if you're careful and the steam is not hot enough to hurt yourself. So you can see that I've got gloves on and I'm just very slowly dipping that in, bringing it out, rinsing it out immediately, and that's going to give me quite a nice gradient. But really you can choose to do either of those processes. Just know that you're probably not going to get it perfect the first time, so try and have extra minky pieces cut out and do as many tests as possible so you can have sort of a selection and you can choose the nicest piece for your final plush. What you can do if your gradient didn't turn out sort of dark enough, you can go in and you can add more dye to pieces that you've already dyed. So take them out and dip them slowly back in if you want to make the bottom part of your gradient darker. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm taking a piece that had a nice gradient but it was a bit too pale, and I'm just dyeing the bottom a little bit darker again. Make sure that when you're prepping your minky piece to be dipped into the dye bath, it doesn't have any creases or wrinkles or any folds in it, because that's going to show in your final dye job. Those wrinkles are going to not dye evenly and you're going to have wrinkles in your finished gradient. So just keep that in mind. You want your minky to be moist with water. You probably want the nap to be going downwards. That makes it a bit easier, and you want to just slowly lift it in and out. So here we have a bunch of dyed pieces. I've done probably about 4 or 5. A couple I scrapped because they were just really bad. This is definitely my favourite piece. You'll find that the gradients will usually look a bit smoother once these pieces have been washed and all that excess dye is gotten rid of. And that's just a piece that was dyed to the maximum sort of saturation of that dye pot. So once you've got all your pieces dyed, you're going to rinse them out in the sink as much as you can to get as much dye out as possible with cold water, and then you're going to chuck them in your washing machine. I prefer not to really use any laundry liquid when I'm washing minky like this. You want to run it through a cycle a couple of times. I usually do 3 times for my finished pieces, and then when you pull them out, all that excess dye is going to have been removed and soaked and flushed out of that minky. You also want to make sure that you're washing on cold, never wash on hot. So when you've pulled your pieces out of your washing machine, they should hopefully be a little bit dry. You don't want them bone dry, but you also don't want them sopping wet. So if they are still sopping wet, put them outside for a little while just so that they lose a little bit of that moisture. You want them damp, but yeah, not dripping wet. And before they dry, we're going to need to aggressively brush the nap into the right direction, because boiling the minky really messes up the direction of the nap. So try and work out which direction your nap originally went. Sometimes this can be a little bit hard, but you really want to get something like a cat slicker brush, something with sharp teeth on it, and you just want to brush all that nap out so it's nice and smooth, so that when it dries, it's not going to dry and sort of set that nap in a funky direction as it's been messed up in the dye bath. And you can start to see the actual colours that the gradient is going to come out here. Your gradient is always, and your dye, going to pale up a bit as it dries, because it's obviously going to look darker when it's wet. So try and make sure that when you're dyeing a few shades darker than you think it will need to be when you eventually wash it and dry it. So to finish up fixing our dyed minky, we're just going to very gently iron the back of our piece, and that's going to smooth out any wrinkles that have been caused by the boiling water interacting with sort of the plastic backing on the minky. You can then go and brush it one more time. I like to just sort of rough it up a bit and then brush it again, both ways, and eventually leaving it so that it is brushed in the right direction. And that way your minky is nice and smooth, it doesn't have any wrinkles, and the nap is going to be facing the right way. And then it's pretty much done. You can let it dry and use this piece on your finished version of your plush. If your gradient isn't totally perfect, or it's not quite as dark, or it might be a little bit patchy in places, I like to go over it with a bit of airbrushing if you have the option to do that. It is nice to have the actual dyed gradient in the plush though, because with airbrushing it's sort of only on the surface, but when you dye the gradient into the plushie, it's actually embedded and sort of penetrating every single fibre and depth of that piece of minky. Here's some sort of gradients that I've used for previous plushies. They all need a bit of a brush and a wash before they'd actually be used on a plush, but that's just some examples of what you can do on larger pieces, and you can see that I've done these dye jobs several times before I've used them on the final character. You can see that you sort of get a fair bit of variation, and I think I used these years ago. They've been just sitting in my fabric collection. I would definitely use the best gradient on the final plush, so those are sort of seconds as far as the gradient in the dyed minky goes. The other thing that's nice about having your gradient actually dyed in as opposed to airbrushed on is you can sew over the top of it without sort of ruining the nap of the minky. With airbrushing, if you did any sort of decorative stitching or embroidery over the top, it's going to sort of part the outer layer of the minky, and that's going to show the underneath sort of fibres that haven't had the dye touch it. But anyway, that's pretty much the whole process. I hope you learnt something about dyeing gradients in minky, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!